You are listening to the Nostalgia Podcast with myself, Brian Scarffe, and my guest today, Evangelos Nikitopoulos. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you for having me on.
So you are the co-founder of Scriptorium Press, a small independent book publisher which focuses on unusual texts, focusing on the lives of saints who perhaps don't have the same prominence today as they once did.
hmm
Could you tell us a little bit more about the project and how you got interested in it in the first place?
Yes, certainly. So the idea for a scriptorium actually goes back to when I was in college with my friend, and we both had this shared interest in early Christianity and the medieval period and the literature of that time. And we felt there was a gap in some of the available translations in English or in modern languages for some of these texts, as opposed to a lot of the classical material, which has been really much more studied and translated. And then eventually, uh, during the end of the pandemic, we had the idea to put our minds together and create this little venture. And in looking for interesting niche that people would be interested in, we figured that hagiographies, so saints' lives, would be something interesting to explore, especially given that we have large collections of these lives that have been edited, but most are in Latin or in Greek, and they're in 19th century digitized collections now, but not many have been translated. So that was the germ of the idea, and then we have since published 7 titles, and we're always adding new things. So recently we did Saints of Ethiopia, the Life of Saint Simeon, the Stylite of Syria, um, but our most popular title has been the Life of Saint Dionysius the Areopagite.
Interesting. And that is the text which I was hoping to speak to you today about. Maybe could you give the listeners a little bit of an overview as to how we find ourselves in the 21st century in a position where the standard academic discourse um, says that Dionysius the Areopagite is not the author of
hmm
the corpus, and that we actually have two entirely separate figures conflated. How do we get to that point?
Yes, so it's a long history. Essentially, for people who don't know, Saint Dionysius the Areopagite, he is the figure who's mentioned in Acts 17 as being one of the converts of Saint Paul in Athens, and he was called the Areopagite because he was a member of the high court of Athens, so the upper class of Athenian society. And then, as you mentioned, there is this corpus that's attributed to him. It's mentioned a bit later in history, and it was accepted for most of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and even early modernity as being an authentic late first or early second century document. Um, and subsequently, there were certain doubts that were first expressed in the Renaissance period by figures such as Erasmus and Luther. Although the debate still remained quite open, it was only at the end of the 19th century that there seems to have been a more uh, global consensus that was formed in academia around the idea that uh, the person who wrote the Dionysian corpus, which is a series of four treatises that survive and 10 letters, that this person was actually uh, a 5th century or early 6th century Neoplatonist, because there are parallels to, we might say, Neoplatonic doctrines or specific language that's found in the writings of Proclus, who is one of the prominent Neoplatonists. Um, Although since the 19th century, there have been a few, not many, but a few voices that have questioned the consensus in the 20s, and then in the 50s, there was this Spanish writer. Eleuterio Elordui, who wrote a book questioning the 19th century thesis. And then even in the 1990s, we had an Orthodox scholar, Father Dimitrios Daniloi, who in his introduction to the Dionysian works in the translation in Romanian, he also provides some arguments questioning this theory. And then basically our work is really a summary of the debate. In the beginning of the book, in the introduction, we provide a sort of overview of the history of the debate and the argument, and then we provide some of our reasons and some new finds that we contributed to why we think the text is authentic.
Interesting. Perhaps before we go into any further details into what
Mm-hmm.
those debates are, what do you think is at stake over the question? Because it seems to me that when I've brought this up with a few people,
Mm-hmm.
they thought it was kind of a potentially interesting historical anomaly as to whether these were the same person or not the same person, but didn't have any really important effects on sort of Christian philosophy or theology. Do you think that's the case, or do you think it is important to figure out who this person is?
Well, I would say yes and no. I would say the foundations of Christian theology are can be derived elsewhere than from Dionysius. Although I would say the question of authenticity involves the credibility of the church fathers, you might say, because there was this consensus, scientific consensus throughout all of the Christian Middle Ages that these writings were authentic. Even in the West, you have Thomas Aquinas, who quotes them 2,000 times in his various works, and they were really relied on as an authority. So I would say the debate really comes. It's a part of this sort of the moderns versus the ancients debate. This is a form of it where we have these long established beliefs, and then in the 19th century you had these new textual methods that were developed that seem to call all of this into question. Sort of is a similar thing when we find people questioning the authenticity of the Pauline letters, or were the Gospels authentic? Who wrote the Gospels? Or are they just compilations? So it's this sort of a good example of the, I would say, modern secular criticism versus a more traditional understanding of the church fathers.
Right. And you're right to point out how important he is in the West. Most people don't realize that Thomas Aquinas, for instance, cites Dionysius more than he does any other author, I believe. And there are other
Yes.
important commentators in the scholastic period who likewise are similarly influenced to a very great degree. If, in fact, my co-host Sebastian Morello wrote a book on the Neoplatonic influences on St. Thomas Aquinas, and it's quite an important aspect of how sort of early modern scholasticism ended up being incredibly Aristotelian and losing this Neoplatonic element, and it's had enormous effects in the 20th century, in the 21st century, in Catholic theology, and in some ways, a lot of the crisis of rationalism and a lack of mysticism in the Western Church can be drawn back to this misappropriation of the great medieval thinkers like Aquinas and filtering them exclusively through a very specific kind of Aristotelianism. I think even a form of Aristotelianism that the immediate followers of Aristotle probably wouldn't have recognized. So this is a very important question, both for East and for West. I understand. Correct me if I'm wrong. That one of the major elements of understanding Saint Dionysius as potentially not being the late first or early second century Pauline disciple comes down to segments of his writings that appear to be almost identical to the works of Proclus. Is that
Hmm.
correct? Is that the major piece of evidence that's started the doubt, or what was the first thing?
Yes, that was the definitive argument that was put forward in the 1890s. It was by two German scholars, Joseph Stiegelmeier and Hugo Koch. One was a classical scholar, one was a Jesuit, and they both sort of simultaneously were working on this thesis. Although I would say in the case of Hugo Koch, if you read some of his articles that he wrote previous to his official publication of discovering these parallels between Proclus and Dionysius, he was already basically convinced years prior that Dionysius was a Neoplatonist, and the discovery of the lexical parallels just convinced him even further of that. So he had this thesis in mind. It wasn't as if they just found this randomly and then they developed this idea. Academia had already entertained these ideas before, and this was the argument that convinced them. So that was the strongest argument, I would say, which is why we also look at that in depth in the book. And so basically, we read the original articles and the research that's been done since. And in the book, we offer even parallel tables of all the parallel passages, so the readers can see for themselves. What is interesting though, when you do this analysis, and I believe has escaped some people, is that the lexical parallels of Dionysius and Proclus are really restricted in the latter half of Book 4 of the Divine Names. It's not this sort of pervasive influence that people seem to think that there is. For instance, there don't seem to be really any of these lexical parallels in the celestial hierarchy or the ecclesiastical hierarchy. They're really concentrated in the Divine Names, and even within the Divine Names, in this one chapter, or this one book, Book 4, which focuses on the nature of evil. And what is interesting is that in some of these parallels, as we lay out in the book, when you put Dionysius in the left-hand column and Proclus in the right, which it's usually the reverse that's done, you put Proclus on the left to show him as the source and Dionysius on the right. But it does seem to be more natural to read Proclus as taking some of these expressions from Dionysius and not the reverse, because in some instances you have passages that are in a much fuller form in Dionysius that are cherry-picked or abbreviated in Proclus. And what I think is the most convincing argument is that there is this one expression that is used, flowers and supersubstantial lights, which is used by Dionysius to refer to the persons of the Holy Trinity. It's borrowed, at least in my view, it's borrowed by Proclus to refer to the Henads in his cosmology, using the exact same expression. And it's also referred again in his commentary on the Parmenides. He uses that expression, but when he uses it there, he says, as one says, blah, 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 flowers and supersubstantial lights. So this seems to be the closest evidence we have that Proclus is borrowing this expression from an external authority, since he says, as one says, and then quotes this phrase. And then that very phrase the distinctive phrase is used in Dionysius. So in this case where we have two texts that are using the same language and we're trying to find the directionality of the borrowing, I think this is a very strong evidence that would indicate that Proclus is the one who is drawing from Dionysius.
Interesting. And is that a kind of method that would be used in other texts to demonstrate one borrowing from the other. So if you were to simply get rid of the names of who's writing and use it, is that's a recognized sort of genealogical um, method.
Yes. Yeah, so another way would be to look at the coherence of vocabulary to see which text the language fits better. So if you have a certain recurrent expression that is present throughout one text, but not really in another person's corpus, and you find the same expression, it would be sort of to match on the basis of vocabulary and similarity of construction where each would where the expression would fit better.
Interesting. So
Yeah.
since that argument was laid forward in the 1890s, it's been developed further, and other arguments have been put
Mm-hmm.
alongside it to contribute it. For so for instance, if I remember correctly, there's the accusation that he uses anachronistic theological or logical terms.
Mm-hmm.
Is this the case? And what how do you answer these cases?
Well, a lot of these other objections, I would say they're really derivative on the assumption that the text is uh, 5th or 6th century, which itself is based on the Proclean argument. So if you take out that main argument, then a lot of these other contentions are a lot less convincing. So, for example, you mentioned anachronisms. We have the use of the word hypostasis in the treatise to speak of the persons of the Holy Trinity. So while it's true that this sort of theological vocabulary was much more developed and refined in the 4th and 5th centuries, there are early attestations of authors using this word. For example, Origen is considered to be one of the earliest writers who speaks of the three hypostases of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Although, as a prominent scholar, Ilaria Ramelli, has pointed out, this language that Origen is using itself seems to derive from St. Paul directly, who refers to the hypostasis of the Father in I believe it's in Hebrews. And then she even mentions how Philo of Alexandria is already precedes the technical use of this term hypostasis in his writings as well. So these arguments about anachronisms, they're much less conclusive, and I think in all cases we can show that all of Dionysius's language really fits well within those early 2 centuries. In particular, when you compare him to Philo, there are many actually lexical parallels that are quite interesting.
And another charge that is leveled against the case is a lack of citations in the first few centuries. That there would be the expectations that perhaps other early writers might
Mm-hmm.
cite Saint Dionysius.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, it's a good argument, but I would say again it's not conclusive because we have historical parallels to something similar happening in cases where we don't question the authenticity of the writings. So, for example, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, if I'm not mistaken, they're only quoted 150 years after they were composed, I think, by the order Themistius in the 4th century. So there's over a century where they're not mentioned by anyone, and now they're held to be some of the most interesting philosophical texts of that period. Another parallel I would give, Macarius Magnes. He's a very obscure 4th century writer who wrote this refutation of Porphyry's against the Christians, which itself only survives in fragments. And this author, Macarius, he's not referred to by anyone, he's not cited by anyone until the mid-8th century in the iconoclastic controversy. And as you know, in antiquity, many manuscripts survived only in one copy. For example, our copy of Justin Martyr it survives in only one late 13th century edition. So in the case of these very difficult, very obscure writings, I don't see any difficulty in positing that they were forgotten in some library for a couple hundred years and then rediscovered when there was a renewed interest during a theological controversy where people found interesting material to mine from the text, and that helped it gain prominence again.
Interesting. And what are there any other elements to the case that you would like to touch on as well?
Well, yes, there are a few. So, in terms of early citations, even though there aren't any direct citations until the 5th century or early 6th century, there are some very striking lexical parallels we find in early writers. For example, Pantaenus of Alexandria in the 2nd century, Clement of Alexandria uses these very particular metaphors that you don't find anywhere else than in the Dionysian corpus. And then there's even a homily by St. Gregory the theologian, composed in 380 or 381, in which he cites again very Dionysian language, and in his case attributes it, or is in the process of quoting a early authority. He says, as one of those who came before has written most beautifully and philosophically, and then he quotes this interpretation of the angelic hierarchies, which very much seems to line up with Dionysius. So there are these echoes in these 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century texts that seem to indicate at least the possibility that Dionysius was known in some circles. So that is something interesting that is not really much talked about, which we provide evidence for in the book. But I would say that the most interesting discovery that we have made, which I actually hope to publish on in a more academic way in some journal in the future, is this famous reference in the Divine Names 5 to this certain Clement the philosopher, or Clemens the philosopher. So when you look at references to this person, usually editors will say, oh, Dionysius just made this person up. It never existed. He's just trying to add an air of historical authenticity to his writings. So no one has really seriously considered who this Clement might be. So we tried to identify him, and we seem to have found probably who it is. And the closest text that matches what Dionysius is quoting, even on a textual level, lexical level, is the author of the so-called Clementine Homilies, Clementine Homily 17. So I don't know if you know about this text, but it's essentially 2nd or early 3rd century compilation of these reputed debates that St. Peter had with the Gnostic Simon Magus. And there's many layers to the text. Some are probably go back to the 1st century, and there's later redactions that were composed. But in this one particular passage that Dionysius seems to be interacting with, he's attacking the idea that God has a physical form of some sort. In the homilies, Clement, or the author, whoever he is, compares God to the sun, and then to his energies to the rays that are extended from the sun. And he says, just as the sun has a specific form and shape in the sky, in the heavens, similarly we should believe that God, even though he is immaterial in a sense, he does have a form of some sort, because a man was made in the image of God. So it's a very crude anthropomorphic conception of divinity, which incidentally was held by a lot of Jews in the 1st century and 2nd century. So for me, I think that's the sort of greatest tell of authenticity of the Dionysian writings, is that he would interact with this very particular argument in this writer that seems to have been forgotten in later centuries, but was important enough for Dionysius to call him out by name, and he's the only person really that Dionysius interacts with in all of his treatise by name in such a manner.
That's very interesting. So in some ways, the kind of suspicion that scholars bring to the table is to not even believe the testimony of the writer when he mentions somebody else. So just assume that there's some kind of deception going on to self-aggrandize, which I think is a profoundly modern disease, to approach people that way. Of course, the same scholars don't like it when we approach their own work using the same suspicions. I think C.S. Lewis called it sort of chronological snobbery, just looking down on the people in the past. I mean, that's very interesting. It made me wonder, do you think that if the identification of this corpus of writings really is with this late first century individual, is there still a Platonist influence? There does seem to have like a lot of correspondences with what the Greeks were thinking, particularly in the school of Plato.
Yes, I definitely think there is a Platonism of some stripes in there, although I would argue that it is more of the school of Middle Platonism than what we would call Neoplatonism.
So Stoicism?
There might be elements of that as well, especially in book 7 when he talks about the logos and how the person who is united to the logos is well, even though things are not well physically with him. So the idea that you could associating yourself with reason frees you from mundane occupations and problems. So yes, you could definitely see parallels to Stoicism there. I would say the clearest indications of that, well, there are two. So, for example, in the Mystical Theology, which is one of the shorter treatises, Dionysius attacks certain opponents that he doesn't name, and he reproaches them with believing that God is intelligible to one's reason. I'm paraphrasing, I'm summarizing what he says because he uses very convoluted and flowery phrases, but essentially that's what he says. So this is in the Mystical Theology, chapter 2, I believe. And it's interesting that Justin Martyr, who was writing in the first half of the 2nd century, in his dialogue with Trypho, the Jew, when in the early chapters, when he's summarizing his spiritual development, he talks about his time as a Platonist, and he speaks of a dialogue that he had with an elderly Christian man that he met and converted him. And the specific point of Platonism that he attacks is the idea that the mind was of the same essence of God, which is why there's a correspondence between intellect and God, and we could understand the divinity. And he says, such was my foolishness that I believed that my soul could ascend and I could see God himself. So this was a typical Middle Platonic formulation that you find in other writers of the period. And it seems to have been changed or attenuated later on in the Neoplatonic period, when there was a much more greater emphasis on the transcendence of the divine. So at least in this respect, Dionysius' criticism of the secular philosophers of his day and the fact that they believed that they could see divinity aligns very well with an extant criticism that we find in Justin Martyr, who was a Middle Platonist in his youth and then became a Christian. So that's very interesting. And I had another example, but if you have any other further comments.
This is very interesting.
Yeah, so that's one interesting case where I think we could prove the time of writing of the corpus, because there's this correspondence, tested correspondence in criticism. The biggest one, though, I would say, is the what's called the noetic triad of being, life, and intellect. So this is a typical Neoplatonic, or it's been called a Neoplatonic formulation of sort of the stages of emanation from God, which was elaborated by Plotinus and then later by Proclus. So Dionysius, very frequently when he talks about the names of God and the energies of God, he discusses the primary names, which are goodness, being, life, wisdom, and then he explains some other names. So this was the main one of the main arguments that are advanced to show that Dionysius is a Neoplatonist, because he has this typical Neoplatonic formulation of metaphysics, understanding a God in this triad of being, life, and intellect. What is interesting, though, is in the last few years in academia, this the origin of the noetic triad, has been continuously pushed back further and further into the 2nd century, because we've found it in some recovered Gnostic texts, which have it very, very clearly and precede Plotinus. And some have even suggested that Plotinus took it from the Gnostics, and we know that he did in fact interact in Rome with students of a Gnostic school. But even more interesting for me is the fact that actually the noetic triad is present in Philo of Alexandria's commentary on Genesis, when he's describing the creation of the world. And in Genesis, of course, we have God who creates the world. So he creates being, and then he creates life, the animals and plants, and then finally he creates man in his image, who has intellect. And Philo uses these typical Middle Platonic formulations of the logos being the image of God, and the world being an image of the image, to explain this paradigmatic creation. So I would argue that this Neoplatonic triad is actually a Jewish or Gnostic triad that was developed in Middle Platonism, or developed during the contact of Jewish writers and Platonism in the early centuries. So to find it in Dionysius is actually not surprising at all, because we find it in Philo and we find it in later 2nd century Gnostic writers. So that's another example of something that seems to be an anachronism, but when you dig a bit under the surface, it actually fits very well.
So the part of the case is to say that there was a much more sophisticated intellectual scene in 1st century Judaism than we're generally led to believe. That's very interesting, because I suppose that connects also to the Essenes, who are kind of the invisible third section of Jews who aren't named specifically in the New Testament, but various scholars have said that there seems to be a great deal of influence, whether it's through John the Baptist, a potential one-time member, or there are obviously traditions, particularly in the West, surrounding the Holy Family and the Essenes, and some of the early historians calling the Essenes Pythagorean Jews. So it seems to be a real melting pot of Hellenism and Hebrew religion going on at the time, which perhaps lends more credence to a really towering intellect being part of the 1st century scene.
Well, in fact, it's great that you mentioned that, because Dionysius does refer to this sect or community of proto-monastics in his own writings that he calls the therapeutes, who seem to match some of the practices of the Essenes. And Actually, Philo of Alexandria also has a treatise that he wrote called On the Contemplative Life, where he describes this Essene-like community that existed, according to him, in Egypt, but also in Greece, very interestingly, whom he calls the Therapeutes, and he describes them as men and women who lived in solitude, in quote-unquote monasteries, is the word that he uses, in individual cells, who practice abstinence, fasting, vigils, allegorical readings of Moses and the prophets, who partook of a sacred meal, communal meal together. So it's some people have suggested these are early Christians that he's describing. Others believe that this group preceded Christianity but had very similar practices. But whatever the case is we find the word therapeutes attested in no other author but Philo and Dionysius, Saint Dionysius the Areopagite, which is again curious if he was writing in the 5th or 6th century, why he would resurrect this outdated term. But if we assume he was exactly who he says he was, and he was writing in that century, that would again explain its presence in both Philo and Dionysius.
That's very interesting. What a suggestive circumstantial piece of evidence. Are there any other early writers who've been subjected to this kind of assault on their authenticity, or is it?
I would say no one has been more mistreated in history than Saint Dionysius. Are there other parallels? Well, there is Saint Ignatius, who was his writings were considered inauthentic until the late 19th century. So that's a bit of the irony, where he was vindicated at the very time that Dionysius was thrown out of the canon, if you will. But I would say the intensity of the debate comes from the fact that these two authors, Ignatius and Dionysius, because of their early apostolic standing and the very clear evidence of Christian practice and doctrine that you find in them, they became a very sore point of contention in the Renaissance and in the debates between the Protestants and the Catholics in Western Europe. So there was a whole polemical layer that was added to the debate, which I think made it so violent, if you will.
Which to this day, a lot of Protestant groups are very hostile to the idea of pagan influence to Christianity, and so a late dating of the Dionysian corpus would mean that they don't need to contend with it because it can be dismissed as kind of a pagan accretion.
Yes.
But if his work is dated very early, it's much harder to rid Christianity of his influence. And his influence is very difficult to handle in a very low church, anti-liturgical, sort of anti-hierarchical form of the Christian religion.
Yeah, Dionysius is very high church. You have lots of hierarchies, angelic hierarchies, church hierarchies, sacraments, chrismation, Eucharist, very elaborate liturgies, all of which is attested in other sources in the early centuries, but you find it in Dionysius in a very clear and prominent way, which I suppose to people who don't believe in that, it would be problematic for them to accept that early Christianity was in fact of that nature.
What's the response been? I know the book hasn't been published for very long; it's less than 2 years. But how have people responded? Where have the responses primarily come from? From sort of Eastern scholars, or is this something that's been picked up by Western thinkers as well?
I've actually been quite surprised and impressed by the positive reception that we have received. I did not expect it to become so popular. We've had many people reaching out, commenting on how they love the book. We've had some very good reviews on Amazon. We even had someone in Brazil, a small Orthodox publishing house that is currently translating it into Portuguese. And yeah, so we have had some criticisms on of the thesis. However, the book was really meant to reopen the debate. We think that there's some valid arguments that exist that have been silenced for too long, and really the book was meant for a educated lay person who might have interest in the topic and also in the life of Saint Dionysius, which is what we translated in the second half of the book, the hagiography of Saint Dionysius. So right now I'm working on publishing it in a journal. We have condensed the thesis and published part of it in the Romanian journal, Orthodox journal Revista Teologica, so it was accepted there. But my hope is also to write something specifically on the Clementine material that I mentioned earlier, and have that published as well. And I think just to get the ball rolling and get people to start talking about these texts again.
Excellent. That's really interesting. It's not the final word. It's hopefully the first word in a new golden age in Dionysian scholarship. You're right
Yes.
that there is a second half to this book. It's hagiography. What
Yes.
can you tell us about that? When was this written? If I remember correctly, it's quite a late date. And what can that actually tell us about his life? Is it sort of based on oral traditions?
There is some oral traditions that are referred to in there about the episode in question is the crucifixion darkness that Dionysius is said to have witnessed in one of his letters. He writes against this pagan philosopher called Apolophanes, who's attacking him for converting to Christianity and abandoning the religion of his forefathers. And Dionysius, in his response, tells him, "Well, don't you recall when both of us were in Egypt, we witnessed this strange eclipse that occurred many years ago, and doesn't this show that God has control over the elements?" He uses this as an apologetic argument. In the hagiography, the author, Michael Sinculus, who wrote in the 9th century, who's a 9th century monk and from the Holy Land, and then he was even a candidate for the Patriarchate of Constantinople at some point, even though he declined. He mentions this oral tradition that it was actually this crucifixion darkness that was the main evidence that converted Saint Dionysius when he listened to Saint Paul, because he connected Saint Paul's preaching and the discussion of the crucifixion of Christ in Palestine with his own experience of what he had witnessed, this eclipse that he refers to. So there is some additional elements that we learned from the hagiography that's not directly attested to in the life, but it's why I liked it was because it was a very beautifully written hagiography, nice figures of speech and metaphors, and it was just very
Is it
very
originally
well.
written in Greek? Sorry.
Yes, it's written in Greek, and it was written in this very Atticist classical style of Greek that was popular in the Byzantine Empire at the time. So it's a nice text to read just for that reason, and to see how people wrote at the time and what they believed about Saint Dionysius. And it's also a very complete life in that it takes elements of his writings and biographical remarks that he makes and forms a coherent narrative of what his life was like and what it might have been like, and fills in the gaps. And then the second part is a translation of a Latin passion, the Passion of Saint Denis of Paris, because there is again this tradition in the church that Saint Dionysius of Athens eventually went to the west and was martyred in Paris, and was served as the first bishop or missionary of Roman Lutetia, which was Paris at the time. So that's a shorter Latin Passion from probably the 7th century, Merovingian period, which is also interesting, and that seems to be directly based on oral tradition of the local church there.
Interesting. So actually, that brings a separate
Controversy.
accusation of mixed identity. So I believe that scholars also say that regardless of the question over Dionysius and pseudo Dionysius, that this Western Parisian Denis is also another character. So what are your thoughts on that? And did how as a sort of an expert in the area, what do you think?
I'm how should I say? I'm not as great a proponent of the identity thesis between the two Denises. I think it's likely we could make a good historical case for it, but ultimately we can't know with as much certainty. So I'm much personally more invested in the authenticity thesis of the writings than the identity thesis, although we do spend quite a bit of time in the book examining what the arguments for and against that would be. I would say in favor of the traditional view that it's the same person. In the earliest hagiographies in the West that refer to Saint Denis of Paris, we are told that he preached there under the pontificate of Clement of Rome, which would place him in the apostolic era. We also know that his deacon, one of the co-martyrs of Saint Denis of Paris, was called Eleutherius, which is a Greek name, and it's been indicated by scholars that a lot of the early hierarchs in Gaul at the time were Greeks. For example, Saint Irenaeus of Lyon. We have a lot of Greek names, so it would be consistent with an early dating to find this Greek from the East coming to preach in Gaul under the pontificate of Clement. Interesting actually, when we were composing the translation of the Latin life, because this has also been an area of controversy. There was an earlier editor, I think probably in the 18th century. He was so embarrassed by the fact that the life mentioned that Dionysius or Denis preached in Paris under the pontificate of Clement, because that seemed to discredit his argument that it was a different Denis, that he actually changed the text and the manuscript and took out the reference to Clement and just said after the preaching of the apostles or something like that. He paraphrased it. So it goes to show you, it's a little anecdote, but how seriously some people take this debate, that they'll even alter words in ancient manuscripts.
They're attached to the outcome over the rational investigation of the question itself.
That's true.
Very interesting. I find that, and this doesn't have any scholarly weight at all, but there is a real beauty to the fact that the glories of the great Gothic Western cathedrals start in the home of Saint Denis in Paris, and many people see them as perhaps the crowning glory of the Dionysian hierarchies in stone, of the mystical theology expressed through the artifice of human craftsmanship. And so I feel like you can't make any kind of scholarly argument from that, but it feels deep down in the heart, it feels like there's something right, those things all being bound together in a sacred way. But that's all been extremely interesting. Perhaps you could maybe tell us a little bit more just about some of the other texts very briefly, as if because obviously you've got a really wide variety. You've got the saints from Ethiopia. How are you also translating texts from Coptic, or are these sort of Greek hagiographies?
Yes, that was an anthology of Greek texts and Ethiopian texts, which I can't read in the original, but there are editions that were made when they were published in with parallel Latin translations. So those ones we translated secondhand from the Latin translation of the original. Although we were approached, in fact, recently by an Ethiopian deacon who would like to contribute some of his own translations in the future to Scriptorium, directly translating from Ge'ez. So that's something to look for. But yeah, we really translate from Latin and Greek are the two main sources. So from Latin we've done so this Passion of Saint Denis, which is part of this book. We've done the commentary of Rabanus Maurus on Ruth, Judith, and Esther, the three books of the Old Testament. And Rabanus was a 9th century Carolingian bishop from Germany, very learned. He's referred to as the teacher of Germany. Wrote commentaries on most of Scripture. So that was a big book that we did. Let me see. We've done the Conversion of Saint Cyprian, which is the tradition of the Cyprian of Antioch, the magician. That was from a Greek fourth century Greek text. Life of Saint Simeon the Stylite from Greek as well, the famous Syrian saint. Life of Saint Bede. That's been a popular one as well, from the 11th century Latin text, which it's the first time that text has been translated. It's very, very pleasant little hagiography, not very long, which gives you some nice information on the great English saint as well.
Interesting. And I've this morning looked at your website for upcoming books, and my eye was drawn to the Apostles of Gaul.
Yes.
When's this coming out, and what can you tell us about that? Because that seems particularly interesting.
Yeah, I'm hoping to start working on that in the coming month. That would also be an anthology of 7 early apostles to Gaul in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. So they're not very long lives, but they're essentially the early preachers who preached in the various parts of early France. So we're collecting all of those together. So I think that'll be a nice volume as well.
Fantastic. And I urge our listeners to explore your website, which is scriptoriumpress.ca. I believe all the books are also available on Amazon. And yes, we're very big on supporting small independent presses, and as well as that, sort of resurrecting forgotten aspects of our tradition. So I'm really pleased to have been able to speak to you on this very interesting subject.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.